Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Board of Education special meeting, February 8th, 2022. I'd like to go ahead and call this meeting to order and establish a quorum.
Board President Sarah Hines.
Yes.
Board Clerk Tess Arthur.
Yes.
Board Member Carl Palestrini. Yep. Board Member Anne Marie Rosen.
Yes.
I'd like to mention to the audience here that this meeting is being audio taped and streamed. Next, may I please get a motion to adopt the agenda?
I move to adopt the agenda.
Second.
Board President Sarah Hines.
Yes.
Board Clerk Tess Arthur.
Yes.
Board Member Carl Palestrini. Board Member Anne Marie Rosen.
Yes.
Agenda item D, Pledge of Allegiance. Carl, can you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Okay. Moving on to agenda item E, this is public comment on agendized items only. And seeing that we have no public attendance, we will forego public comment. Agenda item 2, the action discussion information items for today's special meeting is a budget study session, planning for the 2022-2023 fiscal year budget. And just for my fellow board members, today's meeting is information only. There will be no action taken. And with that, I will turn it over to Yvonne and Shin.
Thank you, Yvonne. So thank you, everyone, for coming to this special meeting. What we were hoping for today is just to spend an hour or two discussing our budget, some of the background behind our budget. We're going to get into some staffing and some challenges that we see moving forward. This is really an opportunity for the board to get a fairly deep dive into our budget, where it's been, where it's going, and then Yvonne and I are going to take a summary of this and go on a road show. And so we're going to a staff meeting at every school between now and April, and we'll present this to staff so that way we make sure that every staff member in this district has the same understanding of the budget as we all do, as we have to make decisions moving forward. And Yvonne has spent an incredible amount of time on this, a lot of different iterations, trying to find that right balance between too much detail where we lose you and too high level where you have questions. So feel free, in a special meeting like this, it's more informal, so feel free to dialogue. The goal in this is not sit and get, it's that you have a full understanding of the budget. So although I normally tell you, don't comment, just ask questions, leave until the end, give us a heads up, this is informal, this is a dialogue, so we want it to be conversational.
And thank you, Yvonne, for printing out the presentation for all of us. So, and it'll also be on the screen over here for the board members as well, and then it's printed out in front of all of us. Thank you.
Yeah, it's on. I couldn't tell. Okay, so on the next page, the next slide that you have in front of you is just a review of board policy, and it is to just reiterate that the board has responsibility for making sure that as a district we adopt a sound budget that keeps us fiscally sound. On the next page is additional review of board policy. Board Policy 3100 as it relates to fund balance. This is information that we've put in front of you before, so it should be familiar. But we are required under board policy to keep about a 15, it turns out to be about a 15-16% reserve. And that's important for our district as a community funded district because of our cash flow issues that we have every year. And so that board policy is there. The additional reference in this particular policy that I think is important is just this last numbered item number 3 is that we need to make sure that we're providing services for our unduplicated students. and unduplicated students. It really is more, for funding purposes, more applicable to an LCFF district or a state-funded district. But we are not immune or exempt from making sure that we meet the requirements under the LCFF. So one of the things that I think becomes confusing for people when you talk about community funded and basic aid is that all of the requirements are the same. We still have to do the calculation, the LCFF calculator. It just, what happens is all of our funding, 95% of our funding comes from property tax. In a district that's not community funded, 95% of their funding most likely comes from state aid. Okay, so state aid and basic aid district. And so the UPP students are foster youth, English learners, and low-income students. Okay. Moving on to the next page, I provided a history of the fund balance reserve. And so here you can see that, I really do believe this to be true, that our board has excellent policy for reserves. And it ensures that the district will be able to maintain obligations through difficult times. The state requires us to have a 3% reserve. We actually, under board policy, have a 5% required reserve in addition to the basic aid reserve that we have. And so governmental agencies are required to illustrate how the reserves will be allocated. And so at the bottom of this slide, he's not moving that along. Hey, he's not. It's okay. Okay. So at the bottom of this particular slide on this page 5, we have to show in our financial statements what part of the reserve is non-spendable, committed, and assigned. And so committed are the board required reserves. That's committed, that we have to commit our fund balance to. If you take it, and we'll spend a little bit of time later in the presentation on assigned. And so these are assignments that we generally are using. And one of the assignments that we're going to talk about in more detail is capital projects. And right now, what we have on our books right now is $7.1 million that we believe could be moved to support facility projects that we feel we need to get done in the district. Okay. The other thing that I'd like to point out on this picture is, if you look at the first column where it says unrestricted, there's $26 million of unrestricted reserves, and way over I should have labeled this as total reserve, board required reserve, is that 16.3 I was talking about before. The difference between what we have and what is required under board policy is $10.5 million. Okay, so we have some excess reserve that we can do some things with. One of the things that we always have to be careful with because of our cash flow is different than a state-funded district, is that we have to always watch, if we move those reserves out and we use it for facilities, do we have enough cash to operate through the month of December? Because the month of December is the month where we go really low. But we've been okay. We haven't had to borrow funds. All right, moving on to the next page. This is an illustration of the total budget of all funds for the fiscal year. And so we have the general fund, which is the main operational fund of the district, and it's made up of two types of resources: unrestricted resources and restricted resources, and that gives us the total general fund. Most of this presentation today is going to concentrate on the unrestricted resources of the district. There's very little leeway that we have with restricted funds. Restricted funds, we have to follow the legislative appropriation or the federal grant that was awarded or a local grant that was awarded. And so we have to, on restricted accounts, we don't have any leeway whatsoever except to do the intent of the granting agency. So like I said, most of our presentation will be focused on the unrestricted side. And so we have right now in our most current first interim report is almost $63.5 million in unrestricted dollars. On the other side of that slide, I just put in a high level of detail the other accounts, the other special purpose funds that we have.
And are these 9 other purpose funds, are they under the restricted or unrestricted funds?
They're in a completely different account.
So they're separate inside, so it's that 10 million is on top of the 71 million?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And you can see one of the major, general fund has an account code called O1. And then there's a whole bunch of other accounts that fall under the O1. Food services, for example, is Fund 13. So it doesn't fall under the O1 account at all. And each one of those, child development, is Fund 12. So they have their own separate, completely separate set of books. Okay?
If I can, Yvonne, real quick too, and just to remind everyone, when we do ask questions or comment, if we don't hit the microphone, those at home can't hear us. Nope, that's okay. One of the things we talked a lot about is that idea. Sometimes you hear we got a $63 million budget. Sometimes it's a 72. Sometimes it's an 82. That's what you see here. So I think in general, people, like when I was doing my research, we're a $72 million budget. So that's the total of the unrestricted and restricted. But as Yvonne said, when we're talking about raises or, can we go build this or can we build that, those restricted funds are already accounted for. So that $63 million is more or less kind of what we have to play with. That additional 10 on special purpose funds, I don't really think of that as income or as revenue. In total, we may have $82 million that we do things with, but that is, for example, child development may cost $2.2 million, and we may spend some of that out of the general fund. We may take some in tuition. So try not to think of the $10 million on the side as money that we can spend, or the $8 million in restricted as money that we can spend. The 63 is really what we have to figure out: salaries, benefits, gas for the buses, lights for the schools.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to make sure everybody understands those numbers total up, and sometimes people will tell you we have a different size budget. That's why.
I got a quick question on that one, and it would be, how stable are these 9 other special purpose funds, and how much do they fluctuate annually? Just kind of curious.
Mhm.
If it's not a lot, then
Yeah.
that's one thing, but what's the deal?
So let's take food services and child development, 2 funds that require a transfer from the general fund, it's a transfer from the general fund. So child development is not self-sustaining, and neither is nutrition services. Those are both, and all of the accounts of those 9 other funds are restricted. They're restricted in purpose, and we cannot just move them into the general fund. Districts have gotten in trouble with food services because the majority of food services revenue comes from federal dollars, and it's a very regulated program. And sometimes food service programs run very profitably. And so districts have moved some of that profit into the general fund, and then when they come in and do heavy-duty audits on food services, believe it or not, every 4 years, the audit goes on forever, and they look at everything. They get in trouble, and you have to pay it back. And so nutrition services, we're transferring, I think about 350, don't hold me to that figure, and child development about the same. So they don't earn enough revenue to cover the cost of the program. And as we increase salaries and benefits in those programs, they have people, right? Child development is a people fund, and so is nutrition services. And so when we add people, or we improve our salaries and benefits, those funds are affected, and how much they're affected comes straight out of the unrestricted dollars. Okay.
So I have a follow-up to that, just to be really clear. So the monies from those special purpose funds originally come in through the unrestricted revenue
No.
and then get moved into those funds?
No.
Okay.
No. They have their own funding sources.
Okay.
Those funding sources are federal and state dollars. Well, let me explain. Let's go one by one. Yeah, let me go one by one. So
Actually, Yvonne, before you go one by one, I think my question was similar to Tess's, which you may be able to answer in this too. So, and I think, Tess, this is what you were asking. So when Ted just mentioned that some of the spend from these special purpose funds can come from the general fund, which way, I think what we're asking is, which way is the money flowing? So you mentioned you're taking $350 for child development. So are you taking $350 out of the $2 million and putting it into the general fund to pay for child development, or is it the other
direction?
Okay, I think that's what
you're asking?
Yes,
Yeah, that's a
thank
simple
you.
way to understand that. Yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly right.
Okay, so, thank
Yeah.
you.
One more quick one for me is, Of all of these categories, I see only two that have any recapture potential. That would be child development and adult ed, theoretically. In other words, they're rate-based, fee-based. And when's the last time we ever played with any of that?
Well, you know, on child development, we've raised the tuition rates every year except for this year. And so we are right now analyzing child development for a rate increase, but that's in development. Okay.
Yeah, most of these from a business perspective, we lose money on.
Yes.
Right, so child development, we have to take money. Our tuition does not cover the cost of that program, so we take money out of the general fund, away from other items, and put it in there. Same things, adult education, right? We don't make what it costs, and so we're moving money over, and that's money that could be spent elsewhere. Nutrition services, same way as Yvonne said. Some districts, they make money on their food. We do
Right.
not. We supplement.
So they're subsidized. What about transportation, which is also fee-based? Is that not a part of one of these special purpose funds? No?
So transportation is in the general fund,
Okay.
and it is an unrestricted resource that comes into the district, and we budget the cost of transportation. Transportation, the funds that we get from the state on transportation hasn't changed since 2012.
Wow.
2012-13, right before LCFF was enacted, and they froze it. And they don't give the COLA on it. They don't change it. And so it's something that's being talked about at a legislative level for years, but they never do anything about it.
Why?
I don't know.
Shen, why?
I don't know.
It's really part of the LCFF formula,
Mm-hmm.
and the LCFF formula is essentially in code. And so as part of this, they put this all together. It's also part of the fact that they have a Prop 98 guarantee that they live within, and so you can't have things just growing everywhere. Your growth only comes really from, in the LCFF factors, what the annual COLA is, but it's not applied to transportation, which is a component of your LCFF funding.
Okay, thank you, Shen. Looking at those 9 other special purpose funds, deferred maintenance, that is 100% transfer from the general fund. What happened with deferred maintenance, and that's Fund 14, deferred maintenance was, there used to be a deferred maintenance program when LCFF was enacted where you could apply to the state and for matching funds, and the state would give you 50% of what you were providing in your district to maintain your facilities. Under LCFF, thank you, Shin, for reminding me of that. Many of the categorical programs went away, including that. Governor Brown said, we're giving you so much money that you can maintain your own facilities. So they did away with the deferred maintenance program. Now, districts like us, we've kept it because we move money because we know we want to commit some money to maintain our facilities. And deferred maintenance is just what it sounds like. We're not going to build a building with deferred maintenance, but we're going to do like replace roofs or, replace carpet. Might be a project we move some money into. We also do that out of routine repair, but it would be a place we would move some money. Developer fees is completely self-sustaining. It comes from taxes if somebody wants to add an addition to their house or build a new house on a new property. It's an impact fee, and so the city government gets some of that and schools get some of that. And so developer fees, it's always balanced to the revenue coming in on how we use it. Special reserve for capital outlay is 100% transferred from the general fund. So once again, we take that to the board. Hey board, we want to do some projects to improve our facilities or build something new. And so that comes from the general fund 100%.
And how's that contrived? That dollar amount?
So typically we're going to be, when we're making that recommendation to the board, we will be looking at our reserves, and it would come from our reserves. And I'm going to talk about that later in the presentation because it's funny how it shows up in our financial statements.
It's kind of interesting that you'd have unrestricted actual, at that big number, and then you'd still have this over here.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like for correction type projects where maybe they cost more than we thought, or I still don't see how it's used?
Yeah, so special reserve for capital outlay. The board has approved several projects that we're in process of working on. As a matter of fact, we have all of those. That $3.5 million is fully committed and budgeted to particular projects. Currently.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And those projects will probably be complete within the next year and a half of what's currently committed there. And once again, later in the slides, we'll talk about some of that in more detail. Your self-insurance fund, that is also 100% transfer from the general fund to the restricted fund, and this is for retiree benefits. So if an employee retires early before they're age 65, and in some cases age 66, based on our agreements with the labor groups, we continue to contribute our portion of benefits to those retirees. And so that's what the cost is. And so the amount that you're seeing there is the annual cost to fund that. And it's referred to as OPEB, other post-employment benefits. The private purpose trust is simply a trust account that was set up to support arts. And so any interest that comes in on that account is provided for some supplies or whatever they're needing in that area. Okay, so it always maintains that $1,500 balance. Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay. Next slide. So we're looking, here's some more information on the general fund, and we kind of talked through this pretty in some amount of detail, but I'll just point out that in the restricted side of the accounts, and this is what gives us a lot of work, are 43 restricted resources within the general fund. So those are all the different grants we have: Title I, IDEA, which is a special ed fund, all of the ESSER funds that came in recently. They're in the general fund, but they're on the restricted side. We received a Department of Public Health grant that's in a resource that's restricted. So 43 of those. Some of them require very little work, some require quite a bit of work. And then on the unrestricted side of the funds, we have 5 different sources that we track on the unrestricted side, but they're all unrestricted resources, and they become part of the total revenue for the general of the unrestricted side of the general fund. Okay. On the next page, I highlighted, in our interim reports, you see some of this during our interim reports, and the yellow isn't coming out very good, so now I know not to use yellow anymore. My purpose was yellow and blue make green, which is your combined general fund. That's what I was trying to do there. And so the blue is the unrestricted that we just spent some time talking about, and we can see that how that comes into the district. One of the things I want to point out is if you look at the local property tax on the unrestricted, the blue columns there, almost 95% of our revenue comes in on local property tax. Now, if we were a state aid district, we would see very little, and all of that would be LCFF. In our financial and interim reports, it's just referred to as LCFF sources because we have to put it into the LCFF calculator, okay? And then we have the other 5% or so you can see comes in from federal revenue on the unrestricted side, state revenue, and local revenue. Local revenue is an example of that is interest, leases or rentals that we do. We don't do a lot of leasing, but rentals, when somebody rents our facilities, it comes in through that resource. The yellow is the restricted side, and so you can kind of see what's coming in there. It comes in from different places. Most of it is federal. The states really upped their legislative appropriations, so we have a lot more that's been coming in on state dollars. And then the green is that 71 million that we saw on the other side, the two combined. Okay. All right, moving on to the next slide. This is uses of the general fund. So how do we use those dollars? And so once again, I put it into blue and yellow and the green for combined. And so at the first interim report, we had 54.3 million that we allocated. I'm taking out the 7.9 million just so you are aware, and I want to focus on that just a little bit. So it's that little one that I have to the side of 7.9 million, about 3 from the bottom of that chart. This is contributions to restricted resources. So there's 2 words, there's transfers and there's contributions. Transfers go to other funds like childcare, food services, all of those ones we just talked about. Contributions are going from unrestricted resource to a restricted resource. So when you look at there, the contributions to restricted resources is 7.9. That 54 million does not include that. That's everything but that contribution. And then you can see that same exact amount goes to the restricted resources. And on the combined in the green columns, you can see it's zero because it goes to those resources and then it's budgeted into salaries, benefits, supplies, all of those kinds of things. Okay? So that's what we talk about when we have contributions. And contributions, there's two that we have. One is to special ed and one is to routine repair and maintenance. Those are the contributions that go from the unrestricted to the restricted side of the general fund. Okay?
I have one question, and sorry if I'm not seeing this, but where do the special purpose funds fit in this layout, or do they not? Are they?
They're not there at all.
They're not there at all.
No,
Okay,
we are
got it.
now narrowing our focus to just the
Just-
general fund.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Okay, thank
Unrestricted and restricted sides of the general fund.
you. Okay,
Okay? So right off the top, those contributions to our restricted resources come right off the top. Remember, we had 63 million or so, and now I'm showing we have 54 because they're moved to those restricted resources. What's I'd like to point out here also is if you look at the subtotal salary and benefits, there's 81.54% that goes to salaries and benefits. And so that, in simple terms, 81 cents of every dollar that we have come in goes to support salaries and benefits. So let's just round it to 80 to keep it easy. That's 20% or 20 cents on every dollar that we have to do everything else, utilities, supplies, books, all of those kinds of things, professional services. That comes from the other 20%. So 81 cents on every dollar goes to support salaries and benefits. So
And
we're
is
gonna,
that standard in the industry? I mean, is that
Mhm.
the wheelhouse?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
very
Very
standard.
much so.
Yeah.
Very
Okay.
much so.
Let's see. Yeah. All right. Any questions on that? Okay. Okay. This next slide, it just shows a graph of how we use all of the unrestricted. So the green, it's the green, that 56 million of the total general fund. I'm showing the unrestricted and restricted, but the graph is the total general fund, the columns that are in green, the total. Okay, so once again, it very clearly is. I like this graph because it shows how much goes to salaries and benefits for certificated benefits, salaries for classified staff, and then the employee benefits for both. And so you can see it takes a big chunk of what's available.
and I think, Ted, that was sort of the point you were making earlier on, right? Like, I think there is a misconception about how much of our budget truly is dedicated to salaries and benefits, and I think that's a misconception out there.
Correct, and that's why I wanted everyone to understand at the start that idea of you have the total budget, including special purpose funds, you have restricted, you have unrestricted. So when you look at that amount, $44 million of unrestricted, we don't have a $70 million budget to play with. And so the fact that we're spending a little over 80% on salary and benefits, which not only is the average here, everywhere I've worked, that's kind of what you're aiming for, is about 80%. That is going straight into the pockets of our staff, either in salary or some sort of.
Yeah.
So
So
quick question on that one, Ted. So how important is it for the community to understand that breakdown?
Sure, I think very important to understand that is still where, especially in a basic aid district where your property tax dollars are going straight to the school district, not to Sacramento and then, funneled back through, but 80% of their, on average of their property tax dollars are going to our employees. So I think that's a pretty good
So that'll
thing.
be conveyed somehow, right?
Absolutely.
Along with the cost per student to educate?
You bet.
All right.
yeah. So are there any other questions on that particular slide? Okay, so you all know Shin Green. He's our financial consultant with Eashore Consulting. He's actually, I have discovered in working with Shin since I came on board here, is that he's also has the rare capability or knowledge of, he really has expert knowledge of property tax. And so he's been a really great resource when when we had a year, my first year I was here, where our property tax, I was on the phone to him. It's like, what the heck happened? I like freaked out because in April, the property tax we were projecting didn't come in the amount that we wanted. And so we had a special board meeting, if you remember. And so, I'm on the phone to Shin, what the heck happened? And I'm on the phone to a whole bunch of other people. Well, he can talk me through property tax because he knows it so well. So the next few slides, he's going to share some information with you.
We'll take a little side trip into a little bit of state policy stuff and kind of how the revenues come together. And really the expertise with property tax is born from managing your bonds. Your bonds are a direct levy on the property tax, so we pay very close attention to your tax base. And unlike a LCFF funded district, as they're colloquially called at the state level, where most of the money is coming from state coffers, you are what we call a community funded or a basic aid district. There's a lot of connotations that go with that. People hear basic aid district, and if they're not from a basic aid district, they think to themselves, oh, you've got all the money in the world, you're fat and happy. Really not the case. In reality, you're a basic aid district because you have a very large property tax base and a relatively small student population, but you also have a higher cost profile because of that, right? You have less economies of scale. You also have an area where, quite frankly, to bring people in, to employ them, they want to live in the community, or at least be close by, costs a little more. So the concept of basic aid being fat and happy is often a misnomer. But let's kind of just delve into what this is all about, this community funded or basic aid status. Believe it or not, if you look it up on the state CDE website, when you are basic aid, you go onto a list of what they call excess tax districts. Sounds great, you've got excess tax, right? The reality is that the state sets minimum funding through the LCFF formula. And that's tied into Prop 98, which kind of is a minimum guarantee in California. We will use X% of the budget of the state to fund education. Within that, we have the LCFF formula that determines how that's doled out to all the various students in the state. And that establishes where our minimum funding level is per student. And there are minimum funding levels identified for each grade span, K through 3, 4 through 6, 7, 8, high school grade span. Those minimums are what everyone is guaranteed to be funded at in a school district. They must be funded at that level. This all goes back to Serrano Priest and a bunch of equity suits that occurred that said we must at least get to this bar. So we have these minimum funding targets that are established by formula under the LCFF. Look a little different in every community because every community has different demographics, different, unduplicated counts. Different unduplicated counts, which may potentially end up being, a slightly different amount in total for each district, but there is a minimum for each district. How that minimum is funded is basically a combination of local property taxes and state funding through the state aid process. If you are lucky enough to have local property taxes which get up to or exceed that minimum, you can use those for your programs. They don't take them away from you, although that's been talked about in the past, so always keep an eye out for that in California. But you can use that entire local property tax. In turn, the state doesn't have to contribute to your district. Now, the reality is that the state is legally required to contribute certain amounts, which gives you a minimum state aid amount. So you will see a state aid line item. And if you look back over time, that's locked in when you go into basic aid. So that number will not change. If you had more students, less students, doesn't matter. That legally required amount that the state must give you by mandate, they will give you. But it's a very, very small piece of your budget. Most of it is your local property taxes. And that's when you become a community-funded district. In other words, the revenues flow from your community. In a community-funded district, it's determined each year what you'll get based upon growth in the property tax. You have a factor that's assigned to your district. However much your tax base grows, multiply by that factor, and that's the revenue you get. In theory, in most years, as the tax base grows, that grows with you. I do have a little chart I brought with me. It's not included in here, but I'm looking back over time, and historically, you've had growth in all but 1 year, 2010-11, where you had a 5% reduction in your property tax revenues. That's also experienced. In fact, you could have ups and downs as a basic aid district. A non-basic aid district, an LCFF funded district, there's a state COLA every year. Unless there's a deficit factor to that COLA, they know that next year there's growth. For you, you always have to be prepared for that potential of the lack of growth. Very rare in your community. Some years are very normal in kind of that 4 to 5% kind of tax-based growth range. If you look way back in time to 2001-2, you had a big 16% growth in that year. That's a great, opportunity to do a little more in that year. But you've also had years that are 1.4, 1.6% in between. So what does this mean? Unlike everyone else who hears COLA and this is how we're going to grow every year, your growth is really driven by your tax base, and that's true for all basic aid districts. There are also some other little nuances, but the COLA applies to the target limit, or that bottom amount that they have to fund you at. So that bottom amount may go up every year, but you live above that. But the fact that you live above that doesn't mean because the target goes up, you go up by a similar amount. You go up by whatever your tax base does. And so, hope it never happens here, but I've experienced this in some communities that are basic aid where it has happened. You have a big wildfire that takes out a lot of your housing. Suddenly, you go from here back down to here. In fact, some of the districts in the eastern Fresno area are experiencing this right now with the fires they recently had, where some of the basic aid districts are now no longer basic aid because that revenue source has gone down. So don't count on this every year. It's something you got to project and understand, and it's something that ideally you want to leave yourself a little cushion for, because the last thing you want to do is commit to multiple years of raises with the uncertainty of what the tax base will do. You are fortunate in that your tax base is very diverse, but there are some big players like Pebble Beach Golf Course, which could be revalued and could move the needle for you in any given year. So,
Hey,
when we
Shin,
yes.
could I ask you to expand upon that a little bit more? Because one of the key things I heard, you and I met like my first month on the job, and really helped me understand that idea, in that our tax base is so big and so broad. Because I think sometimes we hear, oh, so-and-so sold their house and it's doubled in cost, and everybody's selling their houses and they're getting so much more. We're going to get tens of millions of more dollars in. And you had kind of explained to me, when the denominator is already that big, it would take something big like a Pebble Beach closing down. But the fact that we're going to build a new subdivision that's going to bring in 50 houses, it's going to move the needle, but it's not going to
It's really about orders
change
of
completely,
magnitude.
correct?
That's correct. It's really about orders of magnitude. And today your total tax base sits at about $20.5 billion. So single family home could be a very nice single family home, could be $1 million single family home. Doesn't move that needle. It's 0.25%, or less, and then you actually are talking about what you get from it being only the tax amount, which is 1% under Prop 13, and we'll talk about that here in a little while as well. But you need some big things to move the needle.
Okay, so I have a couple questions. How quickly can a district, if we drop below that line, like you said it happened in Fresno as a result of the fires and houses burning down, how quickly do we drop from being a community-funded district to an LCFF district?
It's a combination of what your LCFF calculation is each year. So there's two ways it could happen. Way number one is you could have the numerator, the denominator, the tax base shrink, right? Tax base shrinks, overall everything on top goes up and it becomes a bigger number. That's one pathway. The other way is you could have your target grow or shrink. And that would be by the demographic characteristics under the LCFF. So let's say you had a new housing development that was senior exclusive. Only brings in value. No kids are generated from that, right? So that's something that grows your tax base. In theory, puts you deeper into basic aid because they're not changing your LCFF target. On the flip side, you could, let's say, have a apartment complex come in that has lots of kids. And in that case, you may be growing your LCFF target while your tax base may not grow equivalent to that. So really it's finding that fine balance. And it creates that kind of complexity because for you, what you spend per a student is not directly connected in the same way that other districts with the revenue source. You actually have obligations even under the LCFF, under LCAP and other things to make these expenditures, but you probably go above and beyond that in most cases to do special programs, other things in addition. That's all fine and well, but that doesn't really have anything to do with the LCFF formula. That simply sets that base funding level which you live above. So you're a long ways away from falling out of basic aid, but that doesn't mean that, any loss is not a real loss. If for some reason, hypothetical here, I don't think you have this, but let's say you had a major oil concern, that was part of your tax base, and that oil concern said, hey, the ground's dry, it's gone. That gets revalued, those values drop, suddenly your tax base has shrunk. You want to see a good example of that? San Ardo in your county has experienced that. There's a lot going on in South County in Monterey as a result of the oil revaluations. That's a basic aid district that's seeing its tax base shrink. That's real dollar losses in that year. It's not something like with the state, the state will backfill you. Let's say your tax base shrinks, your LCFF, the state just contributes more. There is no contribution from the state until you get back to that threshold. So any change in your tax base, positive or negative, is a real change in total funding for the district. Yes, ma'am.
I guess my question goes to how fast can the state change if we all of a sudden fell out of this basic aid district and until the LCFF? Do they change the next year? Does it take a couple of years? How much do you have to, sort of hold? Are you floating on your own for a year or two while they're changing, or is it, like that?
It's pretty quick, but it's not as quick as you would like. I'm actually dealing with a district that's in the unfortunate position of, you guys are pretty deep. You're not on the precipice of falling out. I have another district that just went in a year ago, kind of fell out the year after, goes back in the next year because we had a super COLA, right? So the target grew really fast. It grew faster than their tax base in that year, so they fell out. That creates a lot of consternation because with LCFF, some things turn on and off. LCFF districts receive ERAF. Basic aid districts do not. So there's certain components of your funding stream that an LCFF district has that you do not have. What does it mean? A less diverse set of revenue sources. And when you have less diversification in your revenue sources, you got to really keep an eye on that main source that drives everything and understand again that it can go up every year, but if there's a year when there's something that has it go down, let's say another housing recession, they're rare, but they do happen. We know that from the Great Recession. That negative that you saw, that negative 5% in 2011-12 or 10-11, is a real loss. That's a 5% reduction in your revenues in that year. You don't get to escape that. LCFF district, they get backfilled.
Quick question here.
Yes, sir.
Why does the state continue this formula of, I know Serrano decision was power equalization, they tried that. Oh, and it didn't work. It was sunsetted, as we know. So is it to their advantage to have, see, the problem with ADA districts is they're really locked into ADA. And the way that's going is not very good. So districts like ours, though, tend to flourish regardless of any fluctuation in students. So there's been a lot of attempts, I think they've talked about it many times. SF squared, all that, trying to keep it in order. Is it to their advantage to continue this? Is it a local control thing? Just curious.
It is a myriad of things, and we start to broach into the wonderful world of Prop 13 in California when we start to talk about that type of stuff. There are some equity decisions that drive us to wanting to have a baseline. We have to have some sort of a floor at which everyone has, an adequate education. Does not preclude other communities from having the ability to go beyond that if they should have additional funding. But there have been times in the past in this state where they've looked at rating that additional funding to help backfill the shortfalls. The reality is that the volatility in our state budget is so massive that it can be very difficult year over year. And you don't want to have the kind of situation where kids have this education because they were educated now, but the next year they have the different kind because now we don't have the money. Then the next year we're trying to reinstall programs. You want to have some sort of stability. And so that's what they're trying to do with this. And you'll notice that Governor Brown was very sage at doing this. He would always hold something back and give you one-time money so you didn't rush all the way to the edge of your funding knowing that there could be that potential pullback. That's for all the LCFF districts that, have guaranteed funding. Basic aid districts kind of have to live like that every year because every year there could be that thing in the community that changes something. I encourage a lot of my smaller basic aid districts to sort of look at their growth and live a year in arrears. And by that I mean that, you know, let's say you had that 7 or 8% growth spike this year. It's not that it happened this year, but let's say that happened. Don't count on all of that, because you don't know exactly what that's all made up of. What if it's something that someone's appealing, you know, like, oh, the county told me my valuation was this, I don't agree, I just built this new office complex, it's not worth that much. There's an argument, then there's an appeal. That appeal will, if they're successful, be reduction in revenue, retrospectively to you. I've seen a few places where the big kind of 800-pound gorilla example I can think of is a power plant goes fallow. It's no longer producing electricity. They value power plants based upon the electricity they produce. Now you have this big hole in your budget. They've got an appeal. It's multiple years looking back, and they want to be recompensated. Then you're working with your county, and your county's trying to get them paid back for what they're owed for the property taxes they shouldn't have paid in the past, but that comes out of your coffers retrospectively. So these are all things that I always just encourage people. It's why you keep such a large reserve, and there's another reason for that as well. But it's be prepared for that potential volatility, because you don't have that nice, easy, hey, governor says 2% COLA, 3% COLA, 4% COLA. You just have what your tax base does.
I would say too, one of the things that I've looked at, the paying attention to volatility in those numbers year to year, I think is important. If we were to, for some reason, lose basic aid status, our whole life changed, right? Like our dollar per pupil would drop at least in half, I believe.
Yeah.
And so it's
That's
not like how soon is the state going to backfill us matters. Like you're talking about laying off staff. It's the only way. It would fundamentally change the way. So it's kind of like at home, right? You may keep a few extra days of food and water just in case. Like you don't keep 10 years worth, right? I don't know that it makes sense at all to in any way plan for losing basic aid status. I think you plan for those year-to-year fluctuations, because we will be having a completely different conversation if politically or for some other reason basic aid goes away. It will fundamentally change the way we do business.
It's not something I foresee in your near-term future by any stretch of the imagination, but calamities can cause it, and if and when they do, these are all reasons why you have these outsized reserves, so that you can have a soft landing. You got enough time to kind of make the moves you need to get things stable. Keep in mind that, again, there's this LCFF target component which changes year over year, and there can be changes in that. It doesn't necessarily mean that a change in the LCFF target is going to bring you back down, because your property tax is your property tax. But it is a question of, do the LCFF growth targets catch up with your tax-based growth? Generally in California, they will not, because tax-based growth is constrained under Prop 13 but resets upon sale, so it's 2% plus whatever the growth for sales in that year is in an area. It tends to live, and your average over the last 20 years is about 5%. Over the last 10 years is just a little under 5%. But you're right around that 5% growth per average. Now, if the state says, hey, we're going to start doing super COLAs every year because we've got all this extra income coming in, that LCFF target may catch up to you. That's okay. Your real funding isn't going down as a result. It's just the target catching up to you. That's of less concern.
Is there any threat to LCFF, to basic aid districts, if the legislation passes to make LCFF districts not go to ADA funding? Like if they're going to take away the ADA funding and go to like the enrollment at the beginning of the year? How are they making up for that loss of money?
Not specific to that. And keep in mind, this is all the piece on the enrollment for or ADA as your benchmark for LCFF districts is really about how we divide that Prop 98 pool at the state, that state money. That's not going to do anything other than shift some here, shift some there. Nothing about that grows the Prop 98 guarantee. Okay. It's really all about how do we allocate it out. And the argument there is that, and it's a sage argument, different areas have different profiles in terms of attendance ratios. You know, if you're in a more rural area where maybe some of the kids are working in the summers or in the start of the school year and harvest season, et cetera, you see differences in ADA. reality is that you got 2,000 students you got to educate. If some are absent on any given day, as we've seen with the pandemic, it doesn't mean you get to get rid of all the other seats. You still got to have a chair for them. You still got to have a teacher for them. You still got to have a program for them, even if they miss a few days. So it's really more about reallocation. But I would tell you this, that anytime there is serious deficit concerns in California, the eye goes to basic aid districts. Just be aware of that. SF Squared, as you had mentioned, is one of the groups that fights really hard to make sure that they avoid that type of stuff, but it has always been something that gets talked about. In the interest of time, let's talk just a little bit about Prop 13, and I'm going to switch to the slide about the LCFF state-funded versus community-funded or basic aid districts. I think we've touched on most of this, but you can have two districts that are very similar in their overall total funding. That being said, they could have very different sources for that funding, keeping in mind it's two pieces. It's your local property taxes, and everyone has their local property taxes. It's just in most places it's a much smaller number, smaller than the minimum funding requirements for a district. And then you have your state aid. This is important because the state tends to pay everyone monthly. That means, you know, July they cut a check, August they cut a check, October, September, you know, through the year, September, October, November, December. LCFF districts have regular cash flow coming to them from the state. Basic aid districts are subject to property tax collections only. There is no big state check showing up. This means you fall under which most counties in California use, the teeter plan. And the teeter plan guarantees your property taxes, so you have to worry less about delinquencies, but you only receive them a few times a year. Your first major chunk or inflow of money is not until mid-December of each year. That's why you always have those kind of deficit conversations and making sure you're not in a deficit position and have enough reserves to live through that mid-December. That's when the first 55% of levied property taxes is allocated to public entities. So you get 55% of your kind of big chunk of funding in December. You next see the next chunk, April, and it's about 40%. And then in August, after the school year is over, they true everything up, and usually the 5% comes there. Although if you have some delinquencies, other things that have to be accounted for, that can be less than 5%. Sometimes it's a little more, a little less, but be aware that it's kind of the cleanup amount after the fact. So really you get your money in two chunks. And that means you got to cash flow through all those periods. So if you get that big check, you can't expend that check until you get it, unless you have reserves to carry you through there. And this is why basic aid districts very frequently have outsized reserves.
But in the past, haven't we had to borrow, or we had talked about
Mm-hmm.
borrowing if we needed to?
That is the backup plan.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That is the backup plan. And to be honest with you, in recent years, that hasn't been such a big deal, with short-term interest rates, which you're borrowing for a one-year period, being sub 1%. Not a big deal. I would just warn you, I'm in the bond space. We're going up, and we're moving pretty darn fast. 1 year, you'd start to have to pay some interest now. So realistically, you want to avoid it if you can. Realistically, those same reserves that help you deal with cash flow, answer a lot of your questions on what ifs if there is a calamity, gives you that kind of backup that you need to have, because again, there is no state check that's going to show up next month that you can use to, you know, cash flow your way through this. You got to have those funds on hand. So yes, you can have the option to borrow. You're not in a bad position if you have to borrow, but it's just an extra expense and extra work for staff that has to be taken care of to get you over that hump if you need to.
Yeah.
I would suggest you have the reserve. They serve multiple purposes. Rating agencies also like to see them. That's why you have a AAA rating. It's not just because you're basic aid. It is because you have a strong reserve level.
So Shen, on that one,
Mhm.
we've done a trans before in this
Yeah.
district, you know, where we've had to go that route. You know, my question on these allocations, are they continuing to calculate between these disbursements? Are they continuing to calculate, you know, absolutely current data between the first, second, and the cleanup distribution? Or is that something that is set at one
Let's talk
point?
Prop 13, because this is
Alright.
all related to Prop 13 and property taxes. Believe it or not, The assessed value, the taxable value against which the levy is charged, is done each year. And it's done each year. You get your bill usually in the kind of October timeframe for the fiscal year we're in, July. Let's talk about this current year, July 22, or coming up year, July 22 through 23. It's not everything that's done on July 1. The actual lock-in or look-back date is the January 1st prior.
Mm-hmm.
So you're already a little in arrears on your tax base because they look at January 1st. Why? Well, you got to look at the permits. You got to know what's been built. You got to have inspectors go out there. All these different things have to happen. So July 1 sets your taxable values, what's in the roll. That's all used to compute the taxes that are levied from, or excuse me, January 1. You set your roll. That's when everything's identified, your values are known. July 1 is when they start the levy. That levy is against the values as of January 1, so it's already a little in arrears. That covers through the whole year. You then reset the next year, January 1. So if something big comes in, that's great, but you don't see a pop from that necessarily right away. There are some supplemental taxes and things that get done. There's some proration. You will eventually catch up for that prorated piece that they may have had that thing in existence. But if that certificate of occupancy isn't issued until after January 1, you don't see it till the next year. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is Prop 13 constrains taxable value growth to 2% per year in growth, so long as it's owned by the same individual. Now on resale, that value will reset to whatever the sales price is. But you have to think about a community like yours. A lot of these folks don't have to sell a home anytime soon. They're not interested in selling home. You may have a lower turnover rate. On average, if you look all over the place, it's about every 13 years on average that the typical home will turn over. Yeah, you might have lived in yours for 40 years. You're the exception. Someone else has, changed 2 or 3 times in that same time frame. So it's about, 1-2% of additional growth for turnover each year. You don't have anything that's new development coming, anything like that. That's what you're constrained to. 2% plus a percent or two. If you're in a hot property area where values are moving up quickly, you might get a little more, and that's why you guys live closer to the 5% kind of range. But there's a lot of pent-up value there. There's a lot of undervalued stuff on your tax base that won't jump to full market value until it sells, and a lot of these people have no reason to sell their homes. So these are one of the things you have to kind of think in that dynamic. So even if you see situations where, hey, property real estate's going like gangbusters, the specific story of turnover in your community may not equate to that. I generally tell my basic aid districts what you plan for is 2% under Prop 13, depending upon how many houses you have, maybe 0.5% to 1% for turnover. And beyond that, you got to show me where that growth is going to come from. Is it new development? Is there a new commercial complex coming in, a new mall, something that will move the needle? In some places, yeah, they have master plan subdivisions and they have 10,000 homes in the community and they're putting another 1,000 in this year. They see a 10% growth in that community. It's great, but you also got 10% more kids showing up at the door that you got to educate too. It's a little bit of a balancing act. If you have high enough home values, it may actually help you stay in basic aid if you're already in basic aid. I've got one of those in the El Dorado County area. They've actually got some master plan subdivisions coming in. The problem is that the average home price is such that the kids that we're projecting will be generated change your LCFF formula so much faster than the tax base will that they'll be falling out of basic aid at some point in the next 10 to 15 years. And they've got to prepare for that. Now they've got to think about how do we educate more kids, how do we build more facilities for those kids. It's a whole laundry list of things. So think of yourself as a little fortuitous as a very strong tax base with not a lot going on. There's going to be things that happen, this, that, and the other, but nothing that's going to majorly move the needle that cause you a lot of static in normal times.
You know what? That is such a huge point. The tax rolls in the city of Carmel are so undervalued because of the length of ownership. By the way, I happen to be one. But they're waiting for it to change with a sale or a passing of somebody, and they've even worked on what you can do with it with your own
Family.
offspring.
Yep.
So they're trying to mitigate this thing as much as they can, but I'm thinking it's so undervalued valued in terms of just the rolls? People have owned those things for
Long time.
a long, long time.
Even that doesn't actually change it.
Do I
Won't
need to
change the
refinance?
value. It does not, it only when you actually physically sell, and as he noted, there are some rules in the works that
Well-
allow family members to transfer amongst one another without changing the value. My mom is a beneficiary of that with her grandparents' house, actually. Long story short,
Well, you know,
your world is a different world for revenues than a lot of your other districts. Today, I looked it up actually the other day, there are about 153 basic aid districts. We're at a high point.
How
We're
many?
only at that high point,
how many?
153.
Okay.
That's a high point. It hasn't been that high in a long time, and we have to think about what's going on right now. Right now, we are in a position where enrollments and ADA are doing this throughout the state. So remember, it's a two-part analysis. You know, the tax base may not be changing much. In fact, in
Mhm.
some of these places, the tax base is growing a little faster as people look to move to more rural areas and they're more enthralled with not being in the urban cores. As that ADA shrinks, that LCFF target comes down. So you get to that cross point where a lot of people are passing into that. Now, once this all stabilizes, a lot of those people will fall back out as those ADAs return, as in theory, as those enrollments return, and their LCFF factors go back up. Of course, super COLAs, other things help move that up as well, and those sorts of things are part of that balancing act. That's a reality that you guys
Yeah.
have to deal with all the time, that these LCFF districts don't really have to think about.
How many total districts in California? You get 153 basic aid. What's the total?
There's I want to say we're around 950, give or take.
That's it?
It's close to 1,000, but it depends on how you want to count them, and part
Yeah.
of it is some of them are. CDE doesn't treat certain charters as anything other than their own district, so the count gets a little weird, but it's about 900 to 1,000.
Well, my last question for you, Shen, is directed towards my friend over here. Do I need to refinance? I mean, I paid $75,000 for it in 1975. All I'm going to say is that
Construction, right? So add on a garage or something, and then
I just did. I'm doing my part
I
for
will not offer
CUSD.
personal financial advice to anyone here. What I will say is this, is that I always get a chuckle out of it because I do have this conversation sometimes with folks who are in the educational space, and it's like, well, let me know when rates are going to go up, and maybe we should do something before then. And I hate to tell you this, but I don't have a great crystal ball. If I did, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. In fact, if anyone had that perfect crystal ball of what interest rates were going to do, they'd be very wealthy and they'd be off doing their own thing on a little island somewhere. The reality is that rates move, and when they move, they tend to move fast and they settle. We've already seen that fast move. December, our 10-year was down at about 0.8. Today, I believe we're at about 10-year was down closer to 120, 130 then. We're at about 180, 190 today. You see those kind of moves. The Fed has announced 3 to 4 moves this year. The market is priced in 4, so that's 1% higher on the short-term rates. Expect that to filter through. Markets are prospective creatures. They've already adjusted for that. What does this mean? From the standpoint of bonds, things are a little more expensive. Historically, we're still at very low interest rates. For some of us who looked at these things back in time, we may remember 12s, 13, 14% rates on mortgages, late 80s, early 80s, late 70s. That all being said, we're still in a very low interest rate environment. But you did make a good point. Should you refinance now? And that's a question a lot of people in your community are asking. A lot of people are asking, should I sell? Should I do something different? Should I add? To the extent you have higher interest rates, it will slow down your turnover of real estate, which will tend to tamp down on your growth rates. Again, another reason to project conservatively. Historically, you've averaged 5%. I would suggest you use something south of that as your nominal projection. I know you do. But don't anticipate the 5% every year because, again, every adjustment for you is real dollar adjustments. It's not like, oh, well, the state will come in and backfill the difference for us. That doesn't happen. So if you overshoot your goal in terms of projecting and it doesn't come to fruition, you got to burn some reserves to make that amount up. That's the only answer you really have.
Okay, So in the interest of time,
Yes.
we may need to move on. But Anne Marie, you had a question. Feel free to ask that.
My question, I guess, would be, you're talking about changing your denominator in terms of looking at the amount of income coming in. And I'm looking at the numerator in terms of changing the number of, costing us to educate students more. So say we're gonna be going into, where we're gonna be having more, SPED opportunities. We're gonna be bringing in, I noticed that we're gonna be bringing in, what is it called, with SPED kids that are coming in that need SDC classes. And in terms of where we're going to be expanding, because, I mean, at some point in time, the housing is going, in Carmel is going to be hitting its all-time high. So people are going to be looking to go out to the outer lying areas, which typically have more, you know, lower income families. You have people who are going to be English language learners. You're going to be having more SPED kids coming in. You're going to be using more resources. So while that basic number of, 23,000 per student, when you get those basic aid, you get the, the SPED kids, that number, you're spending more per student going out there. So what do you do when those areas are the ones that are expanding and those are going to be growing? Do we need to, adjust differently for that?
In terms of how you
Sorry.
project your revenues, I don't think that changes the fundamental math of those projections. Again, those revenue projections live in their own little universe of your tax base. But as I always tell basic aid districts, you really have to learn to live within your means. There's no hold harmlesses. There's no backfills. There's no kind of easy solutions for you. So anything that you do in terms of increasing expenses has to be balanced within the growth profile of your revenues. If you're increasing your expenses faster than your revenues are growing, there is no backfill solution for that. There is no state aid solution. There is nothing. It's on you, and you have to think about the fact that your revenues will be a little more volatile than others, and that it has the prospect to go down, not just up.
And so, like, if we have a great deal of people that are coming in from outside of our district that are pretty much poaching, they're not contributing to the tax base, and yet they are poaching our, the resources. It's not necessary. I mean, I like, diversity and inclusion and everything else, but it comes right down to the number source. They're not contributing to our tax base, and yet they are pulling that, 22,000 per student or 23,000 per student.
Anne Marie, we do monitor that very carefully.
Okay.
Most basics do.
Yeah, we do. We really have really strong, I would think, I don't do this, but making sure that they do have residency. And it's for that reason that you're describing. Okay.
And sorry, just to piggyback on Anne-Marie's question, and wouldn't a lot of sort of what you're talking about, if we do have to support more students that are disadvantaged, English language learners, et cetera, wouldn't that all come through in the LCAP if we get to that point where that needs to be more of a focus, or we need to change our goals as a district? Is that...
It does go through your LCAP, but your LCAP is focused on the use of those resources. It doesn't change the resource that's available to
Okay.
you per se. It's not as if those kids bring additional dollars with them. Now, if you had a LCFF district and you brought those kids in, they bring the dollars with them. In your case, they don't bring the dollars with them, which is why, generally speaking, barring the need to have normal class sizes, because when you get too small, sometimes cohorts get a little tricky to balance the number of classrooms. But beyond that, yes, more kids doesn't necessarily help the situation here.
Right.
That's just the reality of being in basic aid.
So conversely, though, those students who'd be coming in or pulling resources, from us, they would also be taking resources away from the districts that they were supposed to have been at. So if they were, an LCFF fully funded district, and they were over here, then they would be pulling money directly away from them in the other districts, which...
And the state thanks you, because that lets them spread their Prop 98 guarantee amongst that many fewer students. I think that's everything on
Yeah.
LCFF.
Yeah, and just on the one slide, I think the important thing on that last slide that we have with Shen is that we do have to do an LCAP, and you all are aware of that. That is an LCFF requirement, and every district has to prepare an LCAP. All right, moving on to the page, we are going to focus just a little bit more on property taxes, and I'm going to move quickly because we have a lot of information to cover. Yeah, this is slide 15. Yeah, so this shows, yeah, we keep a lot of historical information in the business office on property tax, and I use that. The year that I said I freaked out, I hadn't prepared that budget, but it was a very valid projection, and then the revenue came in lower than was projected. So it does happen. So this is a history of our property taxes that come in. There's 5 different pots that it comes in. And so you can see the change year over year on the last column. And so for first interim, I actually am using a 5% on current, and there's reasons for that. I looked back historically, but we've got I have projected 60.2 million from property tax coming in for this fiscal year.
Can I mention something real
Yes.
quick on that? So one of the things that I think is interesting, Yvonne and I have talked about, if you look at the last few years, we go up, and again, this is a majority of our funds, right? So when we're thinking of raises and things like that, this is the bulk of our money. So if we're going up about 3 million every year, and we know 80% of our budget goes to salaries, it's about 2.4 million. So at the end of the day, it's like that's what we would have to play with. So as people are wanting benefits increase, they're wanting salary increases, they're wanting subsidized childcare, whatever it is, the math is the math, right? If we get about 3 million more and we spend 80% on benefits, you've got about 2.4 million. If you spend more than that, as Shin mentioned earlier, you are spending reserves, and you don't want to spend one-time money on ongoing costs. So that's kind of the basic math Craig and I have gone in to this year with, is we go up about 3 million and 80% of that's 2.4. That's what we have to play with.
Yeah,
Anything more than that, we're spending out of one-time money, or we're cutting something else.
it also needs to be said that this is a bit of an art, these projections, that also involve tea leaf readings, and things like that. They're really hard to get accurate. They really are, and that's a burden on basic aid districts. You're relying on that projection. So I got to tip my hat to how close we've come, and thank you, and where we are.
We actually do a pretty good job, and this district has historically on projecting those revenues. And so there's reasons for it.
There are factors.
We reach out to, and we get updated information from our assessor's office, things like that help us make those projections. One of the things that Shin mentioned, I'll just mention really quick, is how it flows. And so, the tax book is put out in July after our fiscal year already is starting. And so we don't have up-to-date information at the point that we're preparing those projections. But we use historical trends, and we look at and reach out to others to get those projections as good as we can. All right, if you'll turn to slide 16, I really like this graph. It shows the up and down. And so the bottom number that you see there, the bottom number is our enrollment, and so you can see the change in enrollment. The red bar is the change in our property tax revenue that came in, not the assessment, but the revenue that came in. And then the little figures at the top that you may not be able to see that well, but I have it over here in the chart, that shows the amount of revenue that came in from property tax. So you can see, and Shin talked about this earlier, in 2010-11 we went, right? And you can also, another important thing to see here is that those earlier years before we had the Great Recession, we were having year over year amounts of percentages coming in that were over 6%, 7%. One year it was almost 11%. After the Great Recession, we started to go back up when we had those negative property tax assessment. Our revenue started going up slowly, and now it's kind of leveled out at about the 5% range. In that year, where if you look to the chart to the side, it shows the increase and decrease in property tax year over year. And this is an important chart, an important figure. And then the percent change in revenue I put there, and then the salary percent increase that we gave year over year. In 2021, we're showing a 6% change in property tax revenue. But you look at the year before at 1920, that was the year I told you I kind of freaked out. The revenues didn't come in, and I learned why, and I think I've shared this with the board, and it really was a cash flow thing. due to an overassessment in another district that took money away from everybody else. They adjusted it, and then the cash came in 2021. They fixed it, and so we have this this year of 6% growth, but there was a reason for it, a one-time reason for it. The year before, there was a one-time reason why it went down. Okay. All right. So here I'm showing it at 21-22 estimated. This is at first interim 4.44% increase. Any questions on that? So I really like this slide just because it shows that we were higher here, we dipped, and we've never gone back up to that level. Okay.
I'd just add, if you go back to that 10-11 year when we dropped 1.6, so as Shin said, that's real money. So if you're getting $1.6 million less than last year, you can't make payroll unless you dip into somewhere. So if you think back to slide 5 where Yvonne showed our reserves, you have that 5% reserve and then that basic aid reserve. We have enough in reserve to cover that. So that usually makes me feel for a little more comfortable. But if you look, that even during probably the biggest recession in most of our lives, not taking a stab at you there, Carl, in most of us, we only actually dropped 1 year. Now, granted, the other years surrounding that were low, but we did get more money than what we had. So you could have at least kept compensation equal, which during the Great Recession, if you were making the same in 2009 as you made in 2008, you're probably pretty happy. What I worry about is, so even again during the biggest economic downturn I've seen, we only lost money for 1 year. So I feel comfortable with that reserve, that if that were to happen again, we could dip into that reserve, which is what it's for, a rainy day fund. You would dip in and use that, and we wouldn't have to worry about cutting staff or cutting salaries, which is the worst thing you can do during those times. So I think Yvonne's done a really good job of making sure that our reserves allow us to keep our staffing where it needs to be.
Okay. All right, moving on to the next slide.
Yeah. Correct,
Wow.
and that happened everywhere. Whereas the way Yvonne has us set up now, you wouldn't have to. We could weather that storm.
And keep in mind, you can't just issue pink slips whenever. There's
Correct.
defined times that you can do that, and if the incident happens in the wrong time, you got to survive through that pink slip period.
Yeah, and another thing too is we're pretty fortunate that it only happened 1 year, one time. I mean, what if it had been back to back or multiples?
Yeah. Okay, moving on to slide 17. This is just another chart to illustrate property tax revenue because it's such a large source of our revenue. And so here's the property tax revenue in dollars, and in the second column I'm showing the change in dollars. And so when we were talking 2.5 to 3 million, that's not an inaccurate amount. And so that change in dollars, you can see, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, of what actually the actual change was. The percent change is there in the next column. We just threw this in as Social Security, what Social Security COLA got. I need to just double check that 17.1%. I'm like, is that real? And so I'll need to double check that. And then the statutory COLA is what, what LCFF districts are pretty much dealing with. The statutory COLA does not apply to basic aid districts. Some of our resources get the statutory COLA, but not all the time. In historical past, the state has not put the COLA on special ed, for example. This year they are, and we'll see that when we get to the governor's review budget there. So last year they called it in 21-22, the current year that we're in, they referred to it as a super COLA because they were making up for that smaller amount the year before of 2.31. And so this year the projection out of the governor's budget is a 5.33. We will only get that 5.33 on some of our programs like special ed. Okay.
Can I ask a question on the CUSD improvement to salary and benefits? So do these percentages historically have not included percentages based on step and column, correct? That's separate?
That's correct.
Okay, and so is there a way to go back and look and see what percentage that impacts their whole compensation package?
Yeah, I think I have a slide that might show that
Oh, okay.
a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but there is a way to go back and look at that, absolutely. Possibly. Have to think about that. Okay, we'll move on to the next.
Well, and I do think, if I can real quick, it's important when you look at those columns, Social Security COLA and Statutory COLA, one of the reasons Yvonne put that historically on there is I think right now everybody wants to see these big 5% raises and those types of things. And if you look historically, that's just not reasonable, nor would it be probably prudent for us to assume we could do that year over year. For instance, if we wanted to tie our raises to Social Security COLA, we would be giving literally no raise most years. Same thing with Statutory COLA. Yeah, we'd be giving a 5% this year, but there are years when we would have given less than 1%. And so this historical context is important when you're thinking as an employee, are you better to have high raises and none, high raises and none, or to just have a nice consistent raise that you can depend on, which if you look, we've kind of had that 2.5, 3, 3, 2, 2.5, 2.5, where you're able to know you can sustain that. But if you start trying to play the market and going 5 one year because we're doing good, you might be giving 1 the next year. And my worry is once you start giving 4 or 5% raises, that becomes an entitlement, that becomes an expectation. And as you can see from this, we would be bankrupt pretty quickly if we did that.
You know, Ted, I think there was a day when the Teachers Association actually restructured all of their categories because it was totally inequitable. When I first started in this district, you had all these people that were making a lot of money and all these people at the bottom that weren't. So age of employees and the age of your staff is a key factor in this as well. If you're dealing with a bunch of young people, now that's one thing. If you're dealing with a lot of people that are very close to retirement, that has a big impact on what you can do.
I have a question on tying the raises to the Social Security COLA. So is that trending amongst school districts? Are other districts looking at the Social Security COLA and then following that trend, to Ted's point? Because it would be, it's very inconsistent, but is that a trend out there?
No.
Okay.
I think what we're all seeing on the news, whether it's school districts that might be striking or school districts that are asking for more, I think people are using those high COLAs right now to try to convince boards that they deserve more compensation, which I think we would all love to give everybody a 10% raise, 20% raise if we could. But this historical context allows you to see how irresponsible that would be to try to do that every year. If your property tax revenues are increasing at 3% a year and you're giving a 5% raise every year, at some point, right, those are going to hit. And so I just want to make sure that we are well informed that although we might be hearing about surrounding districts offering these big raises, you can't do that consistently. You would then, if you want to get in that game, you'd have to drop to 1% when we're only increasing 1% and 4% and 3%. I can't imagine that as an employee. I know as a teacher, I always knew about what it was going to be, right? It stayed pretty consistent, and I think that helps with morale.
Well, I think one of the other issues, too, is we're constantly compared to other basic aid districts that have a different set of data than we do. St. Helena, for example, and others. So that's always the go-to point. They don't care how it's contrived or how it's formulated or why they do what they do, how many staff they're servicing, et cetera. They just go, they're getting that much. So there's all kinds of interesting stuff that goes with it.
Yeah. The last thing on this, as you've probably already noted, is I did put in a reference to what we have improved. Like, for example, in 1920, what was negotiated was $500, I think, on salaries and benefit increases, and we actually did an MOU and brought that up to $982 that year. Last year we gave a $3,000 off schedule to everybody and improved the health benefits, and this year we've already negotiated an improvement to the health benefits that kept every employee in the district harmless from any increase in their health benefits.
And that was the equivalent to a 0.8 percent
Yes.
raise, is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, that would be ongoing. Yeah, yeah. All right, flipping over to the next page, slide 18. This is what in a for-profit business we refer to as an income statement. It has your revenue minus your expenses, gives you your net profit or your net loss. And so up here in the blue, I have the total revenue going across each year and the change in revenue from year over year, because property taxes are our only source of revenue, and sometimes those other sources go up and down. And so there's the change in revenue that you're seeing across there on line 6. Total revenue is on line 5. Here's all of the expenses in the major categories that we expend them: salaries, certificated salaries, classified salaries, employee benefits, books and supplies, and so on and so forth. And if you look down, and then the 3% required contribution, you can see the contribution year over year to special ed is on line 16. I know I'm going fast. So line 16, I think it's interesting to see, and I went ahead and put what was our increase to special ed year over year. And so you can see that we've had increasing cost in special ed. And then the 3% required contribution to routine repair. And so that, on line 19, we have the total expenses, transfers, and contributions across line 19 there. And I did, on line 20, I showed you the change in revenue, I'm sorry, the change in that for year over year. We need to work at second interim. See, as we work on second interim, we get those projections closer. And then on line 21 is our true profit or loss for the district. Okay, so on line 21, we have our net increase, decrease prior to transfer to facilities. And I'm going to talk about this just a little bit more. And so across the years on line 21, you can see where we've had a pretty good increase in revenue over expenses. After, the way that the SACS report works is we actually put that transfer in before line 21, but to illustrate a point here, I put it in after. And so if you look at 17-18, look at line 22 is the transfer to facilities. You can see from that time frame what we've transferred to improve our facilities. At 17-18, we had 1.6 million, and then we transferred out 3.3 million, and that gave us a net increase or decrease to our fund balance. We were in a deficit amount there, 1.7. But prior to that transfer to facilities, we were in the positive, right? So we actually, this is an example on 17 and 18. It actually hits our books like that. It goes into the current year transfers and hits our books. So it looks like you're deficit spending, but they really weren't in that year.
That was dipping into fund balance
That
to
was
make
dipping
up
into
that
fund
difference.
balance. Mm-hmm. And so underneath that, you can see that the net increase, which is reported in our books that way, and on our financial statements, it would be reported that we were a $1.7 million deficit, but we really weren't. We dipped into our reserves to provide that transfer. But when you look at it in the books, it doesn't look like it that way. So the fund balance is underneath. You have your 19 million on line 26 at the beginning. That net increase or decrease to fund balance pulls in, and that gives you your ending fund balance. So that's how it works. I tried to make it as simple as I could there. It doesn't follow the SACS exactly, but it's pretty close. SACS puts it in some different spots. And so then I want to look at 2021 actual, where we also sent some money to facilities. And I'm sorry, in 1920. You can see that on line 21 in the 1920 column, we had $4 million of what I would refer to as a net profit or a net loss. And in governmental agencies, it's called a net increase or decrease prior to transfer. So I have the term there. And so that year we transferred 3.6 million and we had 344,000 left. So we didn't dip into our reserves that year to do that transfer. But the concept is that we would have been using reserve dollars. There were sufficient dollars in that year to do that without dipping into the reserves. Okay.
A quick question on the special ed. Do all districts get the same help with that, whether they're basic aid or?
Mm-hmm. It's a per
Okay.
pupil.
So we have a pretty sizable number that seems to be going up and up and up and up. I don't know that we
Mhm.
have more kids. I think, does it have to do with litigation?
Some of that. It could be some of that, definitely. We've had some settlements.
It's a sizable increase over
Yeah.
just a short period of time.
And
s-
how much are we supplementing out of the general fund? I mean, we're not getting,
yeah, in this,
I mean, we're not getting,
Not
I'm
that
trying to
number.
find $5 million in special ed funding.
That's a good
no,
question.
this year.
this is the amount on line 16 is the amount that we contribute from unrestricted dollars.
So that's not what we're spending in special education.
No.
That is
Oh, what
just
we're
what we're
spending.
contributing. I think
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah,
point.
that's
This
over.
is
That's what you're asking?
the contribution is increasing. So obviously the spend is as well. That 5.6 is not what we're spending. We're spending more. That's how much the general fund is supplementing the money we get for our students with special needs.
Yeah.
So how do you know what the difference is between the actual and that?
We'd have to look at how much funding we get for our students with
Yeah.
special needs.
Would
I-
it scare us at all, or?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a large, we track it in a restricted resource. That
Okay.
contribution gets moved to that restricted resource.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's, I don't have the figure right off the top of my
No,
head.
that's okay.
Okay.
I didn't expect you to. Does it include any staffing costs, or is it all?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay,
Mhm.
good.
Yeah. So to provide the services for our special needs students, it takes a lot of people. And students with really high-level special needs, that costs us more. And so the amount that we spend is different for every child.
Well, and I'd also add, Carl, you might remember this just from past conversations, but with special education, we also have what's called maintenance of effort, which if we remember, unless something really drastic happens, you can't spend less in 1 year than you spent the prior year. So you're going to see that increase unless, again, something drastic happened. You have to continue to spend what you've been spending.
And I think that's an important note for the public and our community to know, because I think that's a really under-promoted point that you just made, because that number, like you said, will keep going up and up and up for that reason stated, and I think that it's unclear to the general community of why that is. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We are a destination district.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to slide 19. So then I think you ask, I thought, what would I ask? And so how is that increase in revenue spent each year? And so this is a slide trying to illustrate what are our obligations as we go forward. And one of those is our STRS and PERS, is the pension, that it keeps increasing. And so that is a huge concern. So on the first column here, we have the cost of a 1%, and this is calculated. Our system calculates it, does it pretty well. It's $450,000. Now that cost of 1% includes those funds that we transfer to child care that are not self-sustaining. So when we give raises or we improve our benefits, those accounts can't sustain that increase, and so that's added into the cost of 1%. It comes straight out of our unrestricted dollars. And so,
I just want to make sure everyone, $450,000 is the cost of a 1% pay raise for all employees. That, right? So you just multiply that by 2 or by 3 or by 4. So we're just south of $500,000 for every percent someone would ask for.
yeah. Moving down to step 6, you asked what is the cost of a step and column, and so step and column for certificated generally runs us $218,000, for classified $95,000. And so 313, this is something we have a choice in giving a raise. We don't have a choice in step and column. That's set. We have to give it. So improvements to health benefits
Quick question on step and column.
Yeah.
There are people in the community that think that's a raise. Ted, I was going to say there's people in the community that think step and column is the raise, because then they get the raise and the step and column. That is something that we might want to try to clear up.
Well, and Craig and I have talked about this, and Yvonne to some degree too. Our district and/or California does this a little different than what I'm used to, in that usually your raises where I come from are negotiated over the spring, so that you're getting your raise and your step and column at the same time in July 1. Our employees here get their step and/or column July 1, and then, at least in the past, at some point, get their raise, and so it's separated oddly, as a teacher, as a building administrator, I always knew in like February and March, here's where I'm going to be based on both, you know, if I had received 15 credits or something, I could move over. I had another year, and it included that 2.5%, 3% raise that I think most people have gotten used to. Here, the way it's separated is interesting, because I don't think, for lack of a better term, you as a board aren't getting credit for the almost 1% raise every employee gets right off the bat without you doing anything. It's just in the contract. People are going to move from year 5 to year 6, or from BA plus 15 to BA plus 30, whatever it is. And that is real money. They are getting that raise.
Well, you know, the optics on it are unusual too, because the Teachers Association is not going to go there, or any of the associations. You know, thank you very much for step and column. It didn't start that way. So I don't know how much disclosure or how much people really need to know, but it is strange to have two different, you know, raises at different times, unexplained.
It is my hope to align those.
Okay, so moving down on line 10, you can see the cost of health benefits, that increase that we gave this year that went into effect on January 1st. STRS, I'm going to spend a little time on that as well. STRS increase for this year was $314,000 increase, and PERS was $380,000 increase. And I've got another slide on this. So the total cost of salaries and benefits just for these things, with adding in a cost of 1%, is almost 1.5 million. We have some other things that go on. So our contributions on line 19, we don't have a choice, and it's not just on unrestricted dollars. We have to contribute 3% to routine repair and maintenance of total general fund dollars every year.
Yvonne, that 1.45, that is separate of the 1%, is it not? That's just the step and column improvement to health benefits and pension.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Unless my napkin math is wrong. And Craig's waiting for my napkin math to be wrong.
I think it is the total. Yeah, it's the total of the cost of 1% and then all of the rest. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
So I'm counting
17.
I'm counting 700, give or take, for the pension increase, 375 for the health benefits, 315 for the step and column. It is?
Is the figure wrong?
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, it's just 14, 10, and 8. So it's actually closer to 2 million if we add a 1% raise. So we're giving, this is a key point, we are giving, or have given, nearly a $1.5 million benefit, which is about 3% already, just through our statutory obligations to retirement, the health benefits that we chose, and the step and column, which is in the contract. So before anybody does anything in terms of what we would typically consider a raise, we already are giving the equivalent of a 3% raise in true dollars.
Okay, apologize for that. Was working with a lot of numbers here. So
I should have caught that earlier. That one's on me.
Yeah, but it actually is a good presentation, Ted, to show without the cost of the 1%, what just ongoing cost of salaries and benefits are to us. And so that does show that that's 1.5. You add the 450,000 at a cost of 1%, you can see we're close to 2 million. So it's actually not a bad presentation. I just need to label it correctly. We have some other increases.
Just a quick question. You know, so the employers are cost sharing at some level. They get a salary increase to help pay offset costs in STRS. Would that be right?
Their percentage of STRS and PERS increases occasionally. No?
No, it
I
hasn't.
thought it did.
It hasn't changed. It hasn't changed recently. I can bring a table on that
No,
too.
just curious.
Well, thank you, California. In Colorado, it goes up every dang year.
I think it's about 9%. It has increased in some years. It's
And
about
so
9%
only the
for
district picks up the
certificated.
costs?
I'm sorry?
Only the district would pick up the costs? Who's
Yes.
paying these costs?
Yes.
We
This is
pick
a
up an increasing
That's what I'm
cost.
talking about, the
Yeah.
increase.
Yeah, we do. Yeah,
Huh.
this is the district cost, not the employee cost.
you can see Yvonne has labeled their STRS, for example, is rising from 16.92 to 19.10.
Next year.
Yeah, so that's 2% of our entire payroll, correct?
Why is,
Yeah.
why is that fixed for districts but not employees in terms of the costs?
It's not fixed for districts, it's the opposite. It's more fixed for
Well,
employees and
excuse me,
not
I
fixed for
said
the
it the wrong way
district.
around.
Yeah.
Why is it fixed for employees and not the district? That's,
It's
Yeah.
because they set the rates, STRS and PERS sets the rates to ensure that they can service the retirement benefits that go out.
I get
And
that.
so they have a whole actuarial, all sorts of people that do those kind of calculations, and STRS and PERS is historically underfunded, and so they're trying to
Well,
make up for that. Yeah.
especially with the employee rate being fixed, right, Shin?
The trigger that actually caused this was there was a change in accounting pronouncements which required the disclosure of any shortfalls in your pension. The state of California, as the umbrella for PERS and STRS,
Right.
was at threat of having to show that on their books. So when they negotiated how to solve that, they needed some additional contribution to actuarially solve this deficit. The unions were at the table and they said there's no way our members are paying more. The state said we're in deficit position at this point in time. We can't afford to pay more, and so it fell to the offering entities. And that's just sort of how it's been.
Okay.
It's why you see occasionally they'll give you a little break like they did this year on what the rates are to help smooth things out. But that increase is a reality that's been saddled on your backs, and there's no changing that. It's statutory.
I think, Carl, though, your point is well taken in that if it's costing the state 2 to 3% more every year to fund that liability, why is it on the back of the district? I don't think it necessarily is that way in the end, because if we're increasing ours 2%, that's, in this case, I mean, $700,000 less that we can give in employee raises. So it can come on the backs of both of us, as long as we as employees don't think that you should be giving us that $700,000 and the same raise we've always received. We just went through this in Colorado the last 3 years. Same thing. Para out there was severely underfunded, and they did both. Employees went up slowly and districts went up slowly. But we understood if the district is taking, so take that $2.4 million figure. If we have $2.4 million next year, more than this year, that we can put towards employees, the first $700,000 is gone statutorily to
Correct.
retirement.
Correct.
And so it is kind of on the backs of both, unless we, as a group, think we should continue to give the same raises we've always given
Yeah.
and contribute more to retirement.
Well, our only option is to do it through the salary negotiation process, period.
Yeah, but that does have to be clear. The first 700,000
Correct.
statutorily is gone.
Correct.
The next 313,000 by contract is gone. What's really left to negotiate is that delta, which is $1.4 million.
Correct. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. So one more point on this slide on line 16 is the cost of 1% with that increase in STRS and PERS for next year. So that STRS and PERS goes up. I'll show you a history on that. So you can see where we are in the current year and how much it will increase for STRS and PERS, and that's in the green. That's in the green on the last column. So it's quite significant that we have to plan for. All right, moving on to the next page. Here's a history of certificated salaries and benefits and statutory benefit rates. So statutory benefits are the rates that we have to pay. And we are about out of time. Ted, how do you want to proceed? Okay.
We're going to keep going.
Okay. All right, so this, I'll just go through this. So across the top is the historical from 1718, showing the certificated salaries that the district has paid, and then projections for 3 years out. Current year is a projection, and then 2 years out. And the 2-year out projection, I added step and column only, okay? And then we have our health, so then you have your health and dental. These are the statutory benefits that we pay for certificated staff, and for classified staff, you'll see in a minute that it's higher. So we have STRS, Medicare, state unemployment insurance, workers' comp, and the total statutory benefits on those salaries. This came straight from historical information. In 17-18 was 3.6. In the current fiscal year, we're projecting that to be 4.7. Projection numbers will always change. And then so we have total certificated employee benefits. Salaries is 6.2. And then total on line 15 is the total of benefits and salaries of 27 million. Right underneath that, in that column, the section in blue, you'll see the rates of those rates. So STRS in 17-18 was 14.43. Look across to 21-22, we're now paying 16.92. Last year, there was actually a decrease in STRS, and that's because the governor decided he would give some help to schools. In the governor's budget this year, he has very clearly stated no help to schools on their pensions, no more.
So can I ask a follow-up to that? Do they ever go back to the table with the state on the benefit packages and having the impact to both the employee and the district? Is that ongoing or is that annual?
It's not annual, but you have to look at the Sacramento dynamic. And in Sacramento, the dynamic is such that there's a lot of sway from the unions up there. And this has just never caught traction. It's one of those things where your lack of representation in Sacramento is why it ends up being on your back.
Yeah, what's interesting with the governor's budget that came out in January is he is going to give some relief to other state agencies on the PERS rate, but not for the schools. So and they call that contribution on behalf, which we do record in our books, but it's not anything that we're going to get this year.
The STRS and PERS accounts have been like slush funds for the governor for a long time in terms of borrowing, putting some of it back and forth. So there's not a lot of skin off of the governor's nose because it's always running a deficit, period. Has it ever been even? I don't think so. So I guess the question is, you already have a deficit fund and then you're, relaxing the district's contributions to it. Wow.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Anyway, just a thought.
Well, I think what does happen between the January release of the state budget to the May release, we have seen that change. So that could happen. People are groups that lobby hard.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you'll get some movement. All right.
Shin, does it matter that it's a deficit fund year after year after year? Is there any consequence to that?
It's actuarially determined deficit. In other words, you don't have to put the cash out now, but we know we owe it eventually.
Okay.
So it's those future liabilities. It's called kicking the can
Down the road. Thank you.
All right. Looking at line 22, it shows the total. So for 21-22, we can see it's at 20.8% for every dollar of payroll that we pay. We have to put towards statutory benefits. It increases in 22-23 to 23.04. We have a slight decrease in the third year out because it is the unemployment rate goes down.
Can I make
is the projection still with these massive increases in benefits, is the projection going to ever be above 81% or does it kind of stay in line with our increase in property tax values?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I make a
That's
point
what you would hope.
on that too? When you're looking at that blue section, 18 through 22, lines 19, 20, and 21, which is roughly almost $1 million a year, is not included in that prior slide, right? So if you look at that prior slide where we're talking about the increases, although that's not increasing, that is another 4% benefit that we're giving all staff, right? Because you're 2% in workman's comp, 0.5% in unemployment, and a 1.5% in Medicare. That's another 4% off the top that our employees are getting. And although that 4% isn't increasing, I'm not sure the average employee realizes they're getting 23% of their salary, a benefit of that from the district, in addition to step and column, in addition to health benefits, like if one of my goals is to help us all understand total compensation. We always look at that number on the step and column in terms of salary, and our total comp is it's pretty amazing when if you add all of that up.
Yes, yeah. Ted always amazes me with his knowledge of numbers. He's really good at it. On the last section
Gotta
of
be good
this
at something.
slide, well, you're good at a lot of things. On the last section of this slide is just what do we pay, and so you can see that I took an average on line 26 of what we pay for. I took the average of the single employee plus one and the family. If family, we're close to $18,000 or a little over 18,000. And so you can see that that is an ongoing benefit to employees, and showed the change there of how we've improved that over the year on the next line. The ongoing percent, or the percent of increase, which is an ongoing cost. It's not a one-time cost. And then on the very last, we do provide that 50% employee discount for childcare. Now, not every employee takes advantage of that, but the employees that do, it costs us about $250,000 a year. It varies because sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less.
And I think that's another point to understand. That's about a 0.5% equivalent raise. So to me, the question is, do you want to continue to spend a 0.5% raise on 100 people, or give an extra 0.5% raise to our entire employee group for everybody to use? Those are the types of, I don't know that we've asked our staff that, maybe we have, but as it sits right now, and I believe in board policy, it is negotiated, is do we want to get more money in the hands of all of our employees, or give a benefit to a smaller number? And I don't care either way, but I'm wondering if our staff does, and I wonder if they've had a chance to weigh in on that. Similar to health benefits, right? If we have a system where hardly any of our staff take health benefits, they might want us to give more money in raises than increase the district's contribution. Now here, a super majority of our employees take our health benefits. So it makes sense to take the equivalent of a 0.8 raise and cover all those increases, because that's helping out nearly every employee. But something on this is another one where I wonder, has the board truly made clear what a benefit this is to our staff? And there are other ways to use that $250,000 if the staff so chooses.
And we're talking about the child care benefit, right?
Yeah, the
Well,
employees get that subsidized at 50%.
I know. Well, this is not the first time this has come up.
Yeah.
And, quite frankly, it's not equitable, as you know. If you don't have kids, then somebody's getting a service or a district paid, this sort of a situation.
Well, the other piece of
Well,
it too.
hang on.
Oh, go ahead.
It's kind of altruistic in a way that they have allowed this to continue, though, for younger teachers with families, and there probably is something to be said for that. But, I wonder if we couldn't put together some kind of a simple cheat sheet showing all of the hidden costs that we actually put out.
And tie them to percentages.
And put it into percentages, not for necessarily public distribution at this point, but certainly for board information in terms of all the hidden costs. Because, you don't look for them, and you don't add them up unless you get into this kind of detail.
Well, and we also don't look at the number of teachers we have that don't live in the district whose kids are going to school in our district. So there is a value to that as well.
That's true, but that one's harder to equate. Because, the costs at the CCDC are one thing. That's pretty easy. You start getting into the actual, how many kids are doing this and where are they? Yeah, I don't know if you could go there, but
You could definitely average
that. That is a good benefit, though.
You could average that out, because as Shin said, the denominator doesn't change.
correct.
So if we have $100 to educate 10 kids, we're spending $10 per kid.
That's right.
If we send 2 of those kids out, we still have $100 now to educate 8 kids. So we are
Oh, yeah.
spending less per kid
That is
than we
true.
would have to if we didn't let employees. So again, I'm not suggesting we change any of that. I'm not suggesting it's a bad practice.
No.
What I am suggesting is I'm not sure this board / administration has really made clear to our staff the benefits that you actually get for
They have not.
working here. And Yvonne and I have talked a little bit. I think a cheat sheet like that would make sense because, again, even just things, you know, $1 million a year almost we're spending on just some of these statutories. I don't think the average employee knows that.
No, they don't, and they should, because my whole experience in this district is always starting for somewhere else. It's always starting with what are they making up in Santa Elena. That's basically where we start, and we kind of drift down from there to somewhat of a reality with none of the hidden costs, built-in costs, things that we do, even the promotion of the health benefits early, you know, all of those things. I think it's you know, at some point it would be really good to just have that available. We've never done that. And you know what, Ted? I've only got about 30 more minutes because I got another appointment.
We
I
will
don't-
push through
We'll
these.
move quick.
I don't know if you want to continue on or you want to just try to go through it, or
Yeah, let's keep going.
Okay.
Yeah, once Carl goes, we will not have a quorum, so we will be ending the
Okay.
meeting one way or the other.
We'll jump through these pretty quick. So on slide 21, I put together just what does it look like for somebody who's a certificated employee. And so down at the bottom of this slide, you can see that we use the salary schedule column 5, step 16, which is where the largest percentage of our certificated staff fall. And so you can see the salary schedule is there at the bottom. The big takeaway from this is that when you go from 21-22 current, we add that 1% salary increase. And then take it out 2 more years, we go from $173,000 in total comp. Second year out, and this is only giving a 1% increase in that first year, 21-22, that rises to 180 with the change in STRS and the change in STRS basically, and the cost of the 1%. The second set there is the same information, but giving a 1% each of those years and the step. So when an employee gets to year 16 of the salary schedule, they don't get a step. It takes 2 years for them to get that step, and that's how it goes every 2 years. They'll get a step. In the earlier years of the salary schedule, they get a step every year. Okay, so same scenario with the change in STRS and PERS, giving a 1% in those other years, and you can see between the two, that salary goes up to total comp, not salary, total comp goes up to 183,000. Okay. All right, flipping to the next page. Same thing with the classified. Same information on the classified. I want to point out, if you'll just look quickly on line 23 or line 22, how much that our statutory benefits are going up. And so, and this is because of the change in STRS. So in PERS. So in 17-18, we were paying 15.53%. Current year, we now pay 22.91%. It's going to go to 26% next year and 27% in the third year out. So that's pretty significant. The only saving grace is that the amount that we pay in classified salaries is much less than what we pay in certificated because the percent of statutory benefits are higher. And the reason they're higher is because for teachers, we don't pay Social Security. For classified employees, we do. And so that adds to that, plus the higher cost of the pension.
And
Okay.
if you look above at the dollar amounts, that the total statutory benefits paid actually will have doubled in what is that, like 7 years? From 2017-18 to 23-24, the statutories will have doubled.
It's huge.
So
Yeah.
classified get PERS and Social Security. Is
That's
that correct?
correct.
When did they take away the Social Security for classified?
Certificated? you mean?
Certificated,
I
rather.
don't know.
You remember, Shin? I remember that. It was way back. Maybe Reagan did
It's
it.
quite
Who
a while
knows?
ago.
Yeah.
My mom retired 10 years ago, and it was in place then. It predates that,
Deal. Okay.
20 years plus.
Okay. All right, moving to the next slide. I provided the same sort of example I used a custodial salary. And so showing the same thing, I'm just starting to see lots of numbers. It's hard to see some of those numbers. But in 22-23, the number that it says on the salary, it should have been 30. It says 37. It should have been 67. So that will change a little bit. But the second set of numbers has it correct. And so same scenario here. You can see. Let's just go to the second set of what that would cost us for a custodial type employee. And so on that second set there where we gave her 1% each year, it would go from 121 currently, and it would go to 127. Okay. All right, flipping to the next page, 24. Craig, we were going to invite Craig in for this to talk through this history of total comp.
All right, so STRS, just so you know, for employees is 10.25, or approximately that amount. The windfall elimination provision with regards to Social Security has been around for some period of time. I would say easily over 20 years, probably closer to 30. In regards to total compensation, the chart that you're looking at, so for 2021, the average certificated salary for our employees is $118,996, which is approximately the column 5, step 16 that Yvonne was describing previously. Our average benefit contribution for 2021 is $16,418. You notice that that's not our full amount. That's because it's an average of employee only, employee plus one, employee full family, and what we contribute on average to our employees, for an average total comp of $135,414. So that's the big number as an average. That's the middle of our entire certificated group. So when Yvonne has models around that, there are people above that and people below that 50th percentile, so to speak. All three levels you can see on this particular chart exceed the statewide average, the Region 5 averages, which include Santa Clara, Santa Cruz, San Benito, and Monterey counties, and a comparable group of districts that we've been taking a look at, which are other basic aid districts that are between enrollments of 1,000 and 7,500 students. So similar funding models with a relatively close enrollment figures. So we do take a look at that information to see how we're comparing with those other groups. If I look at these particular charts, so if you're looking at entry level, BA plus 60 on step 10, or on the maximum, which I'm on that chart with the little apples down in the corner there and the 3 bar graphs. Over the course of the 10 years, it is a 26.9 compounded increase. So if I go from the first bar in each of those sections up to the highest bar in each of those sections, and you can see there's a steady increase, that is a 26.9 compounded increase to salary. Averaging, I like averages because it gives me the long look, as Ted always talks about playing the long game, is 2.69% increase a year, not including step and column movement. Okay, this is not including step and column. It's just taking a look at the same point on the salary schedule each year and comparing that to the year after. And if we take a look at the contribution for health and welfare benefits, it's a 12% increase over the 10 years, or an average of 1.2 increase a year. So if you take those two figures together, you're looking at an average increase of 3.9, roughly.
How often are we looking at health and welfare benefits and reevaluating what we're offering?
So at this point in time, we're actually pulling together or trying to get a date settled with a committee that's part of the contractual agreement that takes a look specifically at the benefits that we offer. And so we're trying to go back and actually take a look right now. The committee is supposed to be brought together actually every year to kind of keep an eye on that. COVID's posed some challenges, so we're pulling that group together right now. On the next item, we don't gather or we don't receive the same information in regards to our classified employees. I'm looking at actually how we might be able to pull that together. What I wanted to give you an idea is what do our salaries look like in comparison to other similar positions around the state. Actually, this is data that comes from CSEA, so they send out a request to all districts to submit this information. They synthesize it and then send the report back out to us as districts who've participated. So what you'll see here is this is a reflection of the starting hourly salary for each of the types of classifications that are listed there. So if I take an account clerk 2, in relation to all districts in California, what our starting salary is above the 90th percentile for all districts in the state of California. So although there are a couple of outliers here, And this doesn't include health and welfare benefits, which we believe we're competitive on as we take a look at that data and other ways. It does show that our starting salaries for classified positions remain highly competitive in relation to the other districts in California. So those kinds of things are important. If we want to provide a quality service, we want to make sure that we have quality comparisons in relation to our districts around us and around the state, so that we get the best people providing the service to our students.
Okay.
So those are my two.
Yes, thank you.
At least to start.
Yeah, I'm going to fly through these next slides. On 26, on slide 26, it's just another projection or portrayal of our contributions to special ed and routine repair and the change. I showed that on a previous slide. I will mention that 3% is not enough that we contribute to adequately maintain our facilities. It simply is not enough, okay? The next page is the transfers to deferred maintenance and special reserve capital outlay. And we're going to invite Dan Paul over for the next slide, but I'm going to talk through this just really quick. On page 28, Dan, come on. Dan is going to come on over. This shows the projects that have been completed since 2014 from those transfers from the general fund to Fund 40. And so that's $8.7 million that we've done some improvements or additions. It's more like additions, like a fence and a gate, stadium bleachers and press box. So you can see that there. And I'm going to flip over to page 29. And so this is coming out of Fund 14. This is where we would do roof replacements, painting, more maintenance type projects. And so we've transferred money into Fund 14 to the tune of $1.1 million over that same time frame. The total improvements to our facilities over that time frame is $9.8 million. Dan, I'm sorry, I'm taking your glory here, but you're going to get your, if you'll flip over to page 30, these are the projects that we're planning in progress right now. And we have a whole presentation that I'm hoping it's really important, Dan. I'd like for you to see if you can get that done in 5 minutes.
I can be much quicker than that.
Okay.
So you'll see a couple of projects highlighted in yellow. Those are primarily projects that are going to support the high school. The ones that have the double asterisk are funded already. The stadium lights is a standalone project that we've been working on for about a year. And the storage building at the high school and the parking at the high school are two projects that we're hoping to bring to you with budget allocations shortly. The one storage project is back by the back side of the pool. You know, there's a couple of portables back there and some old storage containers and the track shack. Cleaning that area up will allow us to create some staff parking. The other one is the tennis courts at the high school. They're at the end of their life, and part of our facility master plan indicated that we had a desire to place parking there. So the initial studies showed 70 spots. We've done another study that shows possibly 80 spots. Part of that will mean we have to recreate tennis courts. The tennis courts at the middle school are getting to the end of their lifespan as well. So you'll see a line item there for new tennis courts at the middle school. So what we do is build enough to accommodate both the middle school and high school programs.
Is that enough money for tennis court, a new tennis facility down here?
It depends on where we put it. And these are rough magnitude of order pricing because right now with the cost of petroleum going up and down, and basically all materials for construction is just it's a shot in the dark on a lot of these items. The portable buildings at River School is in design. The learning center and a multi-use portable at the district office is a project we've discussed with the facilities committee. It's basically a staff development center which would allow us to bring C&I together and have a training space that could be used where they could bring in grade levels throughout the district and do training.
And storage, right?
And storage for their C&I materials, book adoption. It would support a number of needs that haven't been met in quite a while. Yes, we have discussed all of these.
In the facilities committee only.
Yeah, the facilities committee. The other one is the transitional kindergarten classrooms. We're getting proposals from an architect for right now for that to add portable classrooms at CCDC, which would allow us to move the daycare program into the portables and do the TK programs in the permanent classrooms. There's a handout you have. There's also visual representation on the board agenda that you can look through. If you have any questions, you can contact us, and it shows the locations and some layouts for some of the facilities.
Yeah. Yeah, if we had a good visual, it would have been nice for him to show that, but
Those
You'll see it
pictures are
again.
already
they are.
online, so
Yeah.
that
Yes.
we can all take a look at.
Okay, we'll skip COVID. One thing I'll mention on the slide 30 is that this would be something, these future projects, we do not have the funds in Fund 40 right now to complete them, and so this would be us bringing a request to the board in the near future to say, hey, would you be willing to move funds from reserves to fund these projects? Okay? We're going to skip the next slide on here. You can look at it at your leisure. I need to add in a couple of accounts that were left off, and so I'll do that, but let's skip the COVID funds. I'll bring that to you in a future with the second interim report. You'll see that. And then let's look at enrollment really quick on the next slide when we get to enrollment. And if you'll just... 33 in the lower left. Yeah, 33. This is something we show the board every year, usually separately. We decided to try to move this to a budget study instead, all of this information that pertains to this. So what I'd like you to do is just really look at the bottom. Here's our elementaries, Tular and River, and the change in enrollment. Our projection for enrollment, this is big as we look at staffing, and how that's changing. In the column in yellow, is our projection. Yeah. Yes, that's correct. Yeah. It's a rather strange little thing. Yeah. Yeah, so down 13 at Tular, and we're projecting we'll be down 15 students at River. The good thing about being a basic aid district is that does not affect our funding. The next slide, on slide 34, is Cooper, and then the total of the elementaries and what that looks like. The last page on there is the total enrollment for the whole district, and so you can see that one of the schools is our middle school has had declining enrollment for quite some time, and that of course will trickle down into the high school as the students age up. And so we are showing that we'll have 44 students down at the middle school. High school, actually we're showing an increase as we move the students. But district-wide is the very bottom number there. And so for 22-23, we're showing that our enrollment will increase, will decrease again from 2263 students currently to 2208 projected for 22-23. Yeah.
Is the middle school number due to lower elementary arrivals to the middle school in the 6th grade, or is it attrition at that level?
So this is a trend we're seeing across the state. I think all but one school district we heard recently is declining enrollment. You have people leaving California. You have the younger generation not having children and waiting till later in life to have children. And so you're seeing declining enrollment across the state. And you're seeing it here, right? From back to 16, I mean, we're down 300 kids in that 6 to 7 years that we've been using here. Most importantly to look at is moving into next year, if we're down 55 kids, I think one of the difficult conversations we have to have, because we are a basic aid district and not an ADA district, we don't necessarily lose money because kids leave. But it doesn't mean you're spending your money wisely. Meaning if we lose 55 kids and we keep the same size staff, that is money that we could be using somewhere else. And granted, I know it's COVID, but I think we increased this year, Craig, by like 40 staff members. And so year over year, now granted, a lot of that is temporary COVID folks, but we can't keep a staff of 440 staff members after COVID down 55 kids. And again, down 300 from 16, 17. I would be interested to see if our staff is really that much smaller than it was in 16, 17, because I would guess it would be interesting to see. But again, those are difficult conversations. Is it nice to have class sizes of 16? You bet. Is it nice to have 2 aides in classrooms? You bet. But at the expense of what? So as we start looking at the cost of compensation and those types of things, if you have 3 teachers that retire, and we choose not to rehire those positions because we've dropped by 55 kids, that's the equivalent of a 1% raise.
Sure.
And so I think as we've got to start having those conversations. Would we rather pay more people less or fewer people more, especially as some of these statutories start to increase? That money's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah, and there's also the old formula of combined grade levels, 2, 3, you know, that type of thing, 3, 4. You know, that's what a lot of school districts do, is they put grade levels together to try to get class sizes that are, so, you know, feasible. Is it a good idea? Probably not, but a lot of people do it.
Well, and there's a lot of conversation
And
to
we
be
do it at Cooper, yeah.
to be had, right? I mean, we wouldn't want to eliminate staff just to eliminate them, but in places where it makes sense, where we have a retirement, where we can keep class sizes at the right spot, we need to ask ourselves, do we really want to rehire that position, or do we want to use that vacancy savings to do something else? Because I don't foresee, and Shin, you probably see this statewide, I don't necessarily foresee this number coming back up. I think there's some belief that we might get some of the COVID loss back. I don't think many places are seeing that yet. But I think the trend is decreased enrollment across the state for the most part.
I think we might have a couple of people that are coming, because I know that some of the private schools that the parents fled to with their children have required them to have a 2-year contract. So that 2-year contract is going to be coming up. They're looking at March, to renew, and you should, know those numbers by March to see if they're going to be coming in and looking to enroll back in. But that's not going to be a high number.
And Dr. Knight is correct in the long-term trends are declines, this demographically.
Yeah, the only thing we've talked about that tends to increase enrollment is an economic downturn, because sometimes private school is no longer a priority in an economic downturn. So I know in 08, 09, we saw a lot of students come back to public education from private schools as people were losing their jobs. But I don't see anything locally that makes me think we're going to be a 2,500 kid school district again.
I would agree, although, we're probably one of the few districts that compares well with private schools in terms of all of the services, class sizes, quality, all of those things. There's a possibility of a project out here at Rancho Cañada, whether that'll ever happen, I don't know.
Summer Ranch as well.
Yeah, that one too, but they're, fraught with local politics.
Craig, if you'll talk very quickly about the next slide, it's pretty self-explanatory, but we'll
And I was going to say, and I think it answers some of the questions that you were asking. So I'm on the chart for number 36. So little tiny bar graphs there, but trying to give you a representation or track our different bargaining units within the organization and what they've done over the course of time. As you can see, probably the most significant changes have been in certificated and classified FTE as it relates to this recent year. And if we go back and look, I know that Yvonne's provided some other information that we'll come back to, but a lot of that has been around COVID supports, whether that has been health aides or whether that's been through our mental health supports. Those kinds of things that have happened within these areas more significantly. Fairly flat in many of our other areas, to be quite honest with you. The one thing that's really important to know is this is by FTE. This is not by people. FTE is how much we're actually dedicating as a part of the resource. Sometimes it's a 0.5 and a 0.5 and you have 2 people, but it's still 1 FTE. So just for the big totals, this year for all units was an FTE total of 408.61905. 408. The prior year was 372.0093. So a pretty significant increase from last year to this year in terms of total FTE, but that has to do with a lot of the COVID supports. So we're going to probably see some right sizing in regards to that information as we move forward. But also talking, because the last few slides about enrollment are really, really critical. So my conversations right now are with our principals around their staffing for next year. And as we are collectively taking a look at any retirements or resignations and whether or not those are places in which we're replacing individuals or not. So I think that's an important aspect. We want to make sure that we're, as Ted uses the term, right-sizing things.
Well, and if you look, Craig did a great job on this chart here. If you just look at the certificated bars, which are the first of the two big ones, the yellow is 2016-17, the gray is today. So we're 300 kids less, and we have, I don't know, 10 to 20 more certificated employees.
But it's not really a true measure because of all the COVID stuff.
Yeah, but we didn't hire a lot of the increased COVID hiring was not certificated. It was a lot of health assistants and a lot of folks like that to help manage the chaos that was COVID. We didn't go out and hire a lot more teachers and a lot more, folks like that. So that idea of right sizing, again, no one's saying small class sizes are bad. No one's saying what we're doing is wrong. We're just saying, as you want to use your money more and more wisely, do you not right size the staff to your student population so that you have more purchasing power to do some of those other things people want and need?
It's really important to be looking at it this way, Ted, because if you look at what's going on in Oakland, closing those elementary schools, all they care about is, are they going to be open? That's all they care about. They don't care about any of the funding dynamics, any of the issues, any of it. The parents I'm talking about. So I think that, certainly getting it out there and explaining where we are and why we are where we are is not that it's doomsday, but it's so critical, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes. it
Yvonne,
really is.
should we skip to the fiscal
Yes.
impacts and challenges? We'll hit the governor's
Yeah.
budget update later.
The governor's, I did provide the CASBO recap and then some slides in here on the governor's budget.
What slide is it?
44, fiscal
Attached to the
impacts and
agenda?
challenges.
Yeah,
Okay,
so we're
'cause that's
going
gonna
to
be my last
line
slide,
44.
guys.
So
We've got two more, Carl. We'll go through them fast.
we'll go through it fast. So here we're listing, Ted and I are going to kind of team tag this. So we have a rising cost of pensions, of course, is a concern. I think that we've clearly showed that today. Inflation is huge because things are costing more now. Employees, of course, will also feel that effect of things costing more. Supply chain shortages, we're experiencing that every day. Things are taking a lot longer to get in. Ted, you want to talk about universal TK?
Sure. Universal TK, which again is going to be phased in over 4 years, we're not getting new money for that. So unlike LCFF districts, so I know we're doing some lobbying, but that's going to be an impact or a challenge. That declining enrollment and how we respond strategically is a concern. The myriad of new federal and state funds that we've received all have a need for reporting, for accounting, for plans. And when you're a small central office, that becomes difficult. Ongoing increases to special education. Learning loss. So we have learning loss as a result of COVID-19 as well as some mental health issues. That is going to take increased intervention. The increase of specialized or categorical funding that goes along with that compliance, all of the plans. Nobody's given us money without saying they want a plan and they want reporting and all of this. And then finally, what I've uncovered in these 8 months, the legal costs. In the month of December, I spent $37,000 in legal costs. We have a culture in this community of PRA requests and lawsuits and using the legal system and the Open Meetings Act laws in a way that is very expensive and time consuming for our staff. And I will just tell you, we can't continue at this pace. We're going to spend $500,000 a year at this pace, and myself and other members of the staff are just spending an inordinate amount of time on that. So those are our challenges, but I know Yvonne wants to share a couple celebrations, and then we'll get everyone out of here.
Yeah, I want to point out one thing on universal TK, mandated. We have to provide it. No additional funds for basic aid district for that as it stands right now. School SF2 is lobbying heavy for that for us, which I hope that they gain some momentum on that. Yeah, we'll see.
So I can, if you want, I can share the
Yeah, please do.
celebrations, and then you'll share next steps. So again,
Yes.
we didn't want to leave without talking about the unique opportunities that we have for students here. highly qualified and dedicated staff, both teachers, classified staff, as well as administrators. Our wellness centers, the amount of athletic, extracurricular, co-curricular programs that we have, excellent fine arts, our salary, our benefits, our total comp is top notch. Our schools are great. Our early learning program is great. So we've got a lot of great things going on. What we have to decide is how we continue to do those and do those well with the funding that we have. And Yvonne will talk a little bit about next steps so that we can make sure we're doing that in a collaborative and transparent way.
Right, so our next steps are, we are going to take this in a much more summarized version out to the school sites and do a budget roadshow. And so that is going to help. One of the first things we put on our purpose today was to make sure that we have informed consumers of the information. February to April, Blaze will be working on the LCAP pretty heavy duty and getting that feedback from our educational partners. Second interim, you'll be presented that in March, and I'll give you some updated information from what you've seen today. The numbers will change. In April, we do have a purchase order deadline that helps us close out the fiscal year. May, the governor will come out with his May revise. Often that's too late. We've already prepared our budget at that point, so we usually give an update to the board in the following August of what was changed from the budget that you adopt in July. So June, public hearing for the LCAP and the budget, and for first and June 8th, June 22nd, you'll adopt both the LCAP and the budget.
So quick question, as part of your roadshow, are you going to keep an ongoing Q&A open to everyone in the community and the district for them to ask questions and see responses if they're not able to attend? Yeah.
Yeah, that would be
It's a
something
great
we can
idea.
do.
And
It
we
is.
can probably
Mhm.
do an end of the road, even virtual town hall if we wanted to.
Sure.
Okay, so with that, So I just want to thank you both, and Craig and Dan and all of you. Craig, Ted, this was fantastic. A consolidated version, but you did an incredible job. So thank you. And our meeting is adjourned. Did you have something else you want to say? Okay.